For the people in the back. Because there's always elders, and I'm always very conscious of elders speaking clearly, and I'm so sorry about your voice. If you need to have something retranslated, or if I can repeat.
Yeah, if you need me to repeat, let me know.
Please.
She
don't
can
take
repeat
offense.
for you.
It's those people in the back. I want to reach you. I want to reach you. I will Shatner it up if I have to. Don't make me go there. So, okay. So, we are, as you can see, all women in the biz. So, we'll start quietly. Talk to us about Six Killer.
Six Killer. Alice Six Killer is the most recent imprint, I think, from Native Realities Press. It's written by Lee Francis, and it's illustrated by myself. And it's a sort of Kill Bill meets Alice in Wonderland tale, featuring a woman main character, and she's going and dealing with the murder of her older sister. So it follows along that storyline.
Fabulous. Yeah. Yes, indeed. And both of you have worked on Dear Woman.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Let us talk about Dear Woman. Have y'all read Dear Woman? Okay. All right then.
Yeah, so Dear Woman, a vignette started as just a piece that I did while I was kind of down and out. I had finished my PhD and moved back in with my parents, because apparently that's what you do when you become a doctor. You move back in with your parents. And so I was just living out in the bush, and I had money from doing freelance work that I was able to use to hire Jonathan Thunder as the artist for that piece, because even though I am an artist, it was not something that I could bring into form visually myself, because the story was too close to my own personal experiences. And that piece came out of talking with friends about our experiences, trying to go to self-defense workshops, and then finding that it was actually more traumatizing for us, and that there was no way of processing that trauma from the self-defense workshops, based on our own personal experiences. And so Dear Woman, a vignette, really became a fundraiser for the Arming Sisters, which is a traveling self-defense workshop for Native women, and Lee agreed to publish it, which was really thrilling and amazing for me. And it was my first time stepping out with a comic of my own of that scale. Since many years prior, I had an intellectual property that I sold for $10, and it kind of killed my love for comics. So I mainly was working in games for a long while, because I felt like if I was ever going to make anything in comics, it could just go away right away and be used by other companies. So that's how it started. And then Lee asked me to turn that comic into a series, and I was like, oh no, I'm good. I'm good on one interaction with Dear Woman. That's all right for me. Thank you very much. And instead, I wanted to build capacity. And so he agreed to, even though he was very much involved in the process with us, he helped us both by allowing us to be the forward-facing editors, while he was also helping with a lot of work and getting together a comic collection that would build capacity for Indigenous women illustrators and writers. And so that's why it built into an anthology. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that was my first time as an editor, so she really took me under her wing and kind of explained the jobs of an editor and the process of bookmaking, which was completely new to me and very interesting. So.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Yeah. Fabulous. Will there be more to come?
There has been talk about it, and right now we're at a point where both the vignette version and the anthology have sold out. The anthology will be going into its third printing, and so I want Lee to do that and get all of that to people before we work on a new one. That would be great. So yeah, hopefully there will be in the future another one, and again, I would want to see with that women who worked on the original anthology return, but also have more new people come along as well.
Right. Yeah. Right. Excellent.
Yeah. Thank you, Arigon.
Well, of course. I mean, we're here to talk about our experiences in the business. I come at it from crazy twists and turns of a life lived in the trenches of the entertainment business. Mm-hmm. I used to be a publicist in Hollywood. Mm-hmm. That's how I started my career. I was working with Showtime Networks, before that Viacom Productions. And I worked behind the scenes doing pitch letters to editors at newspapers, TV Guide, Entertainment Weekly. So I had always, my task was like, here, take a season of Matlock, because that's the series I was working on. Read all these scripts. I need a one-sentence description of what happens in the episode and a full paragraph to further explain what happens in the episode, a list of the cast, who's our special guest star, and then pitch it to Entertainment Weekly, try to get them on the set. Come down. Why do you need to talk about this? You know, what's special? Why do I want to tune in on Monday? So that's where I come from as far as like my storytelling. I mean, always been native, that's whatever. But you know, when you're in Hollywood, it's a different thing and it's a different skill set. So I'm happy that I know how to type, and that I had really amazing mentors at Viacom and Showtime. They were two old school publicists, you know, those kind of guys that, oh yeah, I work with Monroe, you remember? You know, those kind of guys. That was gold. I didn't know. I had no idea that I was learning at the feet of these gentlemen, and they shared everything with me, what they knew about how to craft a pitch letter, how to do those log lines. So, and to distill story, and I was like, what a thrill. This boring script, but I need to make something out of it. I always needed to make something out of it. And that was a challenge, and I don't know if you've ever had to do that. It's like an essay, a book report. It's that kind of a skill set. So in 1996, I was afforded the opportunity from my friend Dawn Jackson at the Disney stores. She came to me and she said, I know you draw. You draw really well. I said, yes, I do. And she said, what if? She said, I need help at the stores, man. I need help. And what I need help with is you take the characters from Dalmatians, Winnie the Pooh, Lion King, etc. I'm going to give you spec sheets so you know how to draw them, how they're supposed to be drawn, and have them interact on a pocket tee. I'm like, oh, so here's some samples, here's what they've done. I'll pay you $75 a character. So if you put more than one Lion King thing going on, then that, you know, can I put 10 guys on a pocket? Yeah, so I would try. And I was able to fax my work into Disney, and I quit my job. I quit my corporate job. I walked away. I was like,
Yeah.
and so it can be done, but if you're in that gig, wanting to get out, learn all you can learn. Everything is important. Don't miss an opportunity just because you think, oh God, I can do better things. I need to be promoted. It's like, no, you don't need to be promoted. You need to do your own work.
Yeah.
Because we have so many stories that we have not even tapped the surface on. So that's what I'm, getting, from the business and learning the business. And it's good to learn from the back door in. It really is. Be behind the scenes.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's in some way corollary to a lot of the work that I did. So I worked on social media campaigns. And that's like not on my website anywhere. You can't find that information.
Wait a minute, how did you
me.
learn how to do that?
I think because Canada at the time had money for it, and they were like, hey, this is a required part of television shows now.
Yes.
And you know about websites and Facebook and things.
But did they
and
pick you
games.
because you were native or a woman or just because you had skills?
I think a mix of both. I think it was a
Okay.
mix of both
Okay.
because I work specifically on certain shows that were through Aboriginal People's Television Network.
Fabulous.
Right? So
Yes.
they gave me an opportunity.
Yes. Do you know what that is, APTN? Okay,
Yeah.
good. So, yeah.
APTN up in Canada, and then I started to realize that I could do this work for myself when Isla Moore started, and Jessica Gordon was connected with me, and we started having conversations, and I helped create the social media campaign for I Don't Know More, which is not.
Yes.
Maybe there's a recording here. Maybe that should be recorded. Given that the government has been after me about other things, I'm sure they would love to know that detail about me. Yeah, like the government came after me for context. I made a game called Thunderbird Strike. You strike lightning down at mining company buildings, and the big giant mining trucks ended up on Fox News. The government has come after me. Oh. It's a whole ordeal. So I would prefer if it did not leave the room, that I also worked on the social media campaign for I Don't Know More. But so that was like the first time I was like, oh, you know what? We can actually apply these skills for ourselves outside of the media world and even to our own work.
Yes.
And then after I Don't Know More, I started applying that to my own body of work, and it seems to have worked. It's a good skill to have. So it is very helpful to have experiences. And it is a harder thing for me to for self-promotion. I'm not good at that part of it. And I think as women in this industry, that is something that can be more on the difficult end.
Yeah, definitely. I kind of have a little bit of a different story. When I was in college, I was doing comics. I was working on independent titles. And I was kind of trying to work within the guise of my name, since I have a very unusual name. I would go to comic book conventions and do the portfolio reviews, and I got hired to do a couple of books and stuff, but because communication was basically via email, not by phone or anything, there was sort of like discrepancies, like people didn't come and think, oh, she's a woman, or that wasn't even an issue usually. Mm-hmm. So I could get work here and there, because it's very, very competitive industry, but it's very male dominated. So I continued through college, and I was working on just independent titles and comics, and you kind of go from one project to the next, and you meet and make connections and whatnot. But I encountered a lot of sexism during that period. I've had editors that tried to, give me jobs if I would like go on a dinner date with them, things like that. So once they sort of found out, oh, you're a woman, you're not a man with a weird name, you get kind of weird jobs. So you really kind of have to protect yourself a little bit and know your rights as a person and what type of things come in and maybe kind of like are seedy or not. So I just always, from the get-go, from my very first portfolio review at San Diego Comic-Con, my goal was to be as good as any of the males that were in line there. Mm-hmm. And the very first editor that gave me a review was Randy Stradley from Dark Horse Comics. Mm-hmm. And I remember going up there, and I had my Batman shirt on, and I did Batman pages because I was really into Batman at the time. And he looked at me straight in the face, and he's like, "Why are you here? You're not really here because you want a job in comics, are you?" And it shocked me. I looked at him, and I was like, "Yeah, that's exactly why I'm here. Like, I just spent 6 months on these pages. Like, I have been, waiting in line to meet you in hopes that I would get a job." And I think he was probably having a bad day, because since then I've met him again in person, and he actually is a nice person. That was a pretty devastating first portfolio review for me. And it really made me bitter for several years, thinking that I couldn't get a job in the industry because they didn't take me seriously being a woman wanting to do these books that typically men had drawn. So I just kept doing what I was doing and picking on projects that I felt passionate towards, and eventually got hired doing some larger independent projects. And then I also apprenticed under Howard Chaykin, who is a really well-known name in the industry, in the comic industry. So just basically with my goal in mind is to be as good or better than any of the men that are working in the industry, and to try to let the sexism roll off my back and realize that it's something that I'm going to continually have to deal with in the industry, and not let it take me down. So that's kind of been my story. And I've had I worked at a fabric store during college while I was doing comics, and then I moved on to a video game store, and then most recently I was working as a sign artist for a large corporate company. And anything just involving art where I could keep my skills sharp, as long as I was doing things that were challenging to me. Whether or not they pertained to comics was another story. I was still utilizing art tools. So ultimately, I feel like even though those were side projects and unrelated jobs, they still kept my skills sharp enough to where now that I've finally been able to quit my job again and do comics and art and illustration full time, nothing's kind of dulled down from me taking on like a secretarial job or a job in sales or something like that. So art's always very important to me, and all the things that I've pursued have been sort of in that pathway.
I have a lot of those experiences in game industry, and comics to me were an escape in the sense that I did not even go near comic industry. So I don't go to comic conventions like the leading ones. I'll only come to the Indigenous Comic-Con or small local ones where I know people know me and I've been specifically invited. So it's an interesting, exactly. Well, and because you're in comics, right? And then I know what that's like. It exists in games, it exists in comics. These are, I'm not going to the game developers conference anymore because the last 2 times I've gone, I've had friends that have been roofied both times, and I'm just done with it. Okay? So, I mean, this is very real. And when you're advising young women, entering the industry, and the number one advice is don't leave your drink. Don't leave your drink. And a lot of women give this advice to new women in the industry. That's a very serious and very important consideration, but we also do not want to scare anyone away, because we do have a space. We can create space and spaces of safety for ourselves, but at the same time be mindful of that. And so I've had those experiences in games, but not in comics, but that's because I chose not to engage in comics, right?
I mean, those familiar with comics, I'm sure you've been following the whole Comicsgate ordeal. So it's public news now, the sexism and political division within comics. But it's been existent. It's been a boys' club since it began in the 1930s, way back in the day. It was men, almost always men. I think women didn't start entering the industry until much later, or given jobs till much later. And it would be a bunch of guys in a studio doing comics and sexualizing women because their bosses wanted them to, like, oh, draw this, pulp cover this way. And even in my own career, like when I was starting out, like I did a lot more pinup work than I do now. I am a fan of pinup artists, like Cheesecake Pinup. So there is sexuality in comics, but it's always usually from a male gaze. And in my position now, looking back to the work that I did when I first entered, I see so much of that male influence, and I didn't quite understand how demeaning it was, or potentially dangerous to women seeing other women draw those types of things. So I don't stray away from sexuality in the stuff that I do, but I feel like I have a more confident and sort of a personal style in handling those particular things that are my own, and not through like a male gaze or through what's expected in comics. Because, to be honest, a large percentage of the population of male comic artists, they use Maxim magazine, they use Playboy, they use porn references, and there's been a lot of stuff under fire in regards to representing women within that field. And there's a lot of big name artists that have, Frank Cho is one who's got in trouble for things, and he's very outspoken about it. But yeah, it's there, and when you're a woman, you're entering into that. So it's not only the people working for comics, but it's also the artwork and the reflection of how they're treating female characters or women within that too. So.
And I've been really inspired by Arigon's work, because it showed me that there could be a safe space in comics for only Native comics. Basically, I was like, well, I could make comics that are for Native people, and that would be cool. I think that's what I want to do over here. And I think that a moment for me in watching your work grow, which is just phenomenal. I mean, you have like a phenomenal body of work. But one of the moments for me was when you were curated by the museum. So I was wondering if you could talk to us about that, like the pathway.
The Heard Museum?
Yeah, like how you...
That was so random.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, that was random.
Yeah.
Only because the museum, this is the Heard Museum in Phoenix, Arizona, had decided they wanted to do something for kids. And they looked to comics for something for kids. They knew about Super Indian, but mainly it was the executive director of the Heard at the time was James Pepper Henry, who is Kaw and Creek from Oklahoma. So we had a connection, a tribal connection, because, hey, Stajati, it's like we knew, Indian people, get that Indian woman that draws comics, So Mr. Henry and I had a meeting. Ann Marshall was the other curator, and we talked about what this space was going to look like. And in this conversation was, there are others out there, it's not just me. And they were thrilled to know this. They're like, oh my gosh. And so they brought in people like Jay Ojic and Mr. Roy Boney was in the show, Tom Ferris, others were in the, you were in the show, right?
I don't think I had any.
You didn't have anything.
I think I paused. I think there was a gap for us at that time.
There was a gap.
God, 2008, I met Michael Shayashi, and I didn't even know that there was other natives in comics for the longest time.
Wasn't that weird to finally find?
Yeah, it really was.
That's the thing. Is like we've all been doing this work, and then we finally go, oh wait, there's spaces to start
There's other-
connecting.
Yes.
Because I never thought I would be able to tell any sort of Native stories and actually get published unless I was publishing, which meant usually going to Kinko's and photocopying.
Exactly.
Hand
Right.
stuff, you know?
Staple
Like,
them.
yeah,
Yeah.
but to know that there's a publisher that's what they wanted to do, and then to see
Right.
artists like you, and then it turned out you knew my aunt, and then it just chain linked through all
Yeah,
these
and you know my
Yes.
mom.
And I know her mom. And see, the thing of it is, her mother, Cindy Alvitre, is
Or
like,
my aunt,
oh!
Yeah,
She-
yeah,
and-
yeah.
Okay, so I spent a lot of my time in Los Angeles because of entertainment, but
Yeah.
also being a Native person in Los Angeles, it's like you have to navigate, here's the wannabes over here and the Mr. I just came from Carnegie, I want to be an actor, so, and you have to deal with that too. Do I need a resume? There's those, you navigate through those and like, come on, let me teach you, let me show you. So we have our community, but your auntie was so instrumental in putting a face on Native Los Angeles. It's like, what? There's Indians there? That
Yeah,
didn't.
because we don't have reservations. I mean, the state of Los Angeles is
Yeah.
built right over Tongva land.
We
which
don't
is our
have
tribe.
reservations
Yeah.
either in Oklahoma. So
Yeah.
this is like, what? Oh?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's a melting pot, and it's a lot of like what you're saying, Pan-Indians. You've
Yeah,
got
Pan-Indians,
people
yeah.
wanting to play them in the movies, and we were sucking up and doing this. You've got the New Agers from places like
Right.
Santa Barbara and Ojai.
Yeah.
That want to capitalize in on the crystals and the
Yeah.
sage
Yeah.
use and all that stuff.
It's like, can I touch your
Yeah.
hair? You're so
And then I'm
spiritual.
white passing, so I only get some of the things. I get sexualized, but I don't get all of the things until there's some exoticism they realize, and then absolutely that happens as well. But I do have the privilege of being able to weave in and out, and I know that has helped me be given more space to the point where I fight in certain instances to, in fact, even as we're talking about being women in the industry, I think that something that game industry has a bigger problem with is actually giving the stage to brown men, actually.
Oh, yeah.
Because women are so much less threatening. And so I have been in situations where they will always invite me as their diversity checklist, and I'm like, yo, I don't count that much, all right? You don't get to throw me up there and then say things. And they would invite me saying things like, we want you to surprise them and make them feel uncomfortable, right? Because they know what's going to come out of my mouth, right? They know how I look, and they know they're going to put me up there, and then they want me to say what I'm just going to say, which is just the truth, right? And then they want that as the situation. And so in instances like that, I have burned bridges in game industry because I will say, I am not going to do that. Or I have done things like, say I will be there, and then suddenly, a Tainu chief who's a game developer happens to show up at that time for that presentation, and I am not there because I'm really not super available, and wouldn't you know, he's there, so he can give the talk right now, wouldn't you know? So now there's a brown man on the stage. So, you have to understand the depth to which this runs through the industry, that our very existence makes them uncomfortable. The fact that nations continued on makes people in these spaces uncomfortable. Because very often, Native people are cannon fodder in games, or they are exploited in comics. And so then we have to create these spaces for ourselves and make sure as we're walking along that path that we're not being used, right?
Indeed.
Or tokenized.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Or checkbox.
Or
Like you said.
checkbox.
Yeah, it's like, oh, there's my native.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you.
And they like the multiple checks.
Yeah.
If you're multiple checks, it's even better checks, because then
Then it fills
they
in more
don't.
spaces for
It
them.
fills up more spaces, and then they don't have to spend as much money on diversity because they've checked all the checks with one person, right?
Indeed.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
So I feel like we're at about that time that we
Oh.
should take questions from the audience, unless there's something that you want to talk about.
I just want to be positive. I want to be like, we're all here.
Yes.
We're doing
here,
it.
yes.
We're connected. Our families are connected. We're all working together. Weshoyot and I are working on a game right now called When Rivers Were Trails, which merges games with comics. And I think that there is the potential for a lot more work like that. And yeah, I think just what we're doing is really awesome. And it's awesome that we get a chance to all be together. So yeah.
I mean, I feel really privileged to be working with you, and then also to have met you and seen, like, you're such an inspiration in comics, you know, to be doing what you're doing and to let everybody else know that there's a space for us. Because last year when I came, I mean, I felt like a fly on the wall, like, you know, I'm like, I shouldn't be here, like, I don't deserve to be, like, at a panel, because, like, I don't have this background of things that I've done, you know. So I feel
but you
like
basically multiplied it by a bajillion.
I'm trying to. I have all these things, like, within me that I want to do, and now that I know that there's open space to do them, I'm just like so excited to be able to do projects that I'm so passionate about that are meaningful to me. So.
Yeah.
All right then, so who has a question? Anyone? Be brave.
How many of you are interested or are in games or comics? Like cool. Okay. That's awesome to see, right?
Yes. Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of mentioning about how you each deal with the imposter syndrome, which women feel and men don't feel so much.
Yes. Have you ever, like, had that moment where you have a dark day and go, I'm such a fraud? Jeez. What was I?
All the time.
Yeah, how do you do? Okay, so how do you do?
There was an article published about me where I was referred to as a self-proclaimed designer. Yeah. Yeah, self-proclaimed designer. Yeah. No, I mean, like, it goes further than imposter syndrome, because I think, you know, on the comic flip side in games is Gamergate, and they've definitely targeted me and then supported me. It was weird. That's a weird story. That was a really weird story. But anyway.
But how did you deal? How did you get out of that? How did you, like?
I haven't. I haven't. I think I just worked really hard, and I keep working really hard. And I think that I don't know that there's ever a moment. I don't think there's ever going to be a point I hit in my life where I don't struggle with that. Because even today there was like this CBC interview with Unreserved, and the first question she was asking me, which I asked them not to ask me, because I think that this is a fallacy that happens with people who work in comics. The first question they asked me is like, what got you into comics, i.e. what comics did you read? And I started to talk about Alan Moore's work, and then they, for the purposes of the radio and wanting people to understand who Alan Moore is, started to ask me more and more questions about, well, who's Alan Moore and what comics did he make? And I stopped it. This is the first time I've been bold enough on a radio interview, because it's not live. Yeah. I stopped and I said, you know what? I don't want to answer these questions, because this is exactly part of the issue, is that instead of talking about our work, we are being made to validate ourselves through the comics we read. How interested are we in comics? And it's all the work of white men that we're answering to, because that's what we had to grow up with primarily, right? Yeah. So I was like, you know what? I don't want to talk about Alan Moore. And then they were polite and switched to actually talking about what we should be talking about, which is all of the work that's happening here in the Indigenous Comic-Con. And it's not their fault. It's just an expectation that when you're asked, how did you get into games, or how did you get into comics, that you're supposed to prove how much of a gamer you are, or how much of a comic reader and lover you are, right? And I think that kind of sense of fraud. I mean, you know what? I kind of like comics, but I kind of was like, too, right? And my response is, I'm going to work with people that I want to work with to make comics that I want to see. And so I will never not be somewhat of a fraud.
Always thinking, always wondering. Yeah, where did I go wrong?
Yeah, it's hard for me. Like, growing up, I kind of like parallel it with the Indian, non-Indian validation thing, because our tribe isn't federally recognized. We're state recognized, but not federally recognized. So anytime any Indian thing got brought up in school, you're the token Indian kid, oh, let's ask them. And a lot of the time it was political, like Thanksgiving and stuff. That was always a touchy subject. I don't want to be the person, my parents used to have to go in and talk to the teachers because they were teaching, you know, lies, or having us do, like, she gets to wear the cardboard Indian headdress and they get to do pilgrims. So from a very young age, I can remember my kindergarten class when my mom went in and had a talk, and my dad was furious when he got home, but he didn't want to have to go in there and explain himself to all these people. So she was despite her not being native, she's Scottish, but she used, the stuff that my father had, constantly like gone off about, and tried to explain that in a more neutral sense to the teachers and stuff throughout my academia. But it's always been hard because when I was in college, I didn't even want to really associate with the native aspect of it openly. I would take native classes, and of course, you're in a college class, you're spending thousands of dollars on this college class, and what does the teacher do? She calls you out to tell the class about your native tribe because they just happen to be talking about California. And I stopped her in her tracks at that particular moment, and I said, look, I'm paying you to learn about this thing. Like, I wouldn't be taking this class if I didn't want knowledge. I said, would you call out a black student in an African American studies class and ask them if they had slavery in their family or something really like impersonal, It was a very sensitive thing, and she apologized to me afterwards. She was a white lady teaching a Native American studies class. And yeah, it was just constantly throughout my education, incidents like that to where I didn't want to share who I was with people, partially for exploitation, partially because I felt like nobody else gets asked these questions about who they are unless you're like Native American. Somehow you're singled out and asked 1,000,001 questions. But also not being able to get scholarships through any of the sources that were there because I wasn't federally recognized, it made me feel like I wasn't worthy of something. So I still struggle with that. I still put stories out, and there's still a lot of political nature going on within our tribe. There's different bands that are kind of factioning against one another. They are warring pretty much. Some want federal recognition for the money in the casinos, others don't. And so when I tell people that I'm Tongva, a lot of the time it still feels like I'm an imposter because we don't have these validations. And then I have to remind myself that these validations are only through the government system. Federal recognition is only a government thing, and it's only been, in play for so many years, whereas we've been here on this land for like over 13,000 years, and that doesn't get told in the history books. So I just have to constantly recenter myself and think about my ancestors and my dad and the things that he told me growing up. And not go by their restrictions and rules, because when I start going through their system, I feel like it just comes back on me, and I just feel super insecure and unconfident and beaten down. So I'm constantly fighting that in everything that I do. It's a long-winded answer.
Which is fair, and I think the game we're working on together right now, When Rivers Were Trails, takes place in 1890, and she's working on all of the character art and landscape art for it, but also telling Tongva stories through it. And I think that this is very important, is that all of the stories are being told, and that there's recognition of the many different communities, and that's going to be in schools. So that's the context for this game, right? Is that it will be in middle schools and high schools, actually distributed through the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, which has been incredible. And it's a completely sovereign game. And it's been an amazing game to work with because the funding comes directly from a California tribe who just said, we want this to happen, which is a really amazing and freeing experience, because in a lot of our funding sources, we're still having to answer, even through crowdfunding or primarily through grants and through other companies, there's always some negotiation where we're still sort of pinned as being consultants, or work sovereign is creating an opportunity for a very beautiful game to come out that's very self-determined. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I have a question. Well, kind of a comment and a question. It's, the three of you are kind of in a, how would you say, you're in a new place in society right now because there's no one like you out there, really. There's very few. I think one day they're going to refer to you like you refer to the people inspiring you. So it's almost amazing to think that the younger generation, and they're going to point to you and say, they're the ones who inspired me to go into this. Isn't that just kind of amazing that that could happen, that we could be in a new world, and hoping that our children have good role models, good people to look to be their heroes, So I'm just
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I run
Yeah.
game development workshops for Native youth all over the place, and I'm working on creating curriculum kits that can be deployed to communities with guides, so that it can actually be run by community members within their communities, and that they can build pathways to long-term mentorship, so that they can continue to make games and enter those pathways, because that's something that's always been really important to me. And in fact, what really encouraged me to make games of my own to begin with, because I was playing around with making mods. I made like a native Super Mario mod and other dorky sort of things, and it was my community, my urban community actually, because my family's from Bay Mills, but I grew up in Portland, and in that urban community they wanted me to. And so the ACES chapter was like, hey, can you run a game development workshop for these youth who were like family friends anyway, like I knew them all, right? And I was like, I guess, I don't really know anything about this really, but okay. And then the moment I had to start teaching how to make games, it got me to understand more about how to make games myself, and that it grew from there. And so that's always been something that's been very near and dear to me, and what I hope to continue on in my work. And thinking about the next generations is what encourages me to keep going and to try bigger projects. Because as is, I found a pathway to be a professor, so I could just like kick back to some extent, make a game here, there, maybe, you know, do some publications, be cool. But really it is that I want them to be proud of me. Like I want to be able to be relevant to them and take a game to them and be like, hey, you can play this and then make a game that you want to make. And so that's what drives me through all of it. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up.
Anybody else have a question? Y'all awake out there? Okay. Back there, sir.
Yeah, it's...
Thank each one of you. Thank you very much for appreciating and sharing. I've not met you, but on Facebook, you're an inspiration to me. One of your work. So I appreciate that very much. My question is, can you share your perspective on how working in comics or gaming can impact Native education structurally? Like, because the work that you're doing, to me, is going to reach younger generations in a completely different, new way. How do we use that to structurally change education as it pertains to our youth?
I can talk about a potential project. So comics and games are a potential answer to dyslexia. And so there are communities that I may be working, I hope to be working with, they've approached me, and then it'll probably be a few more years, but dyslexia is fairly common, but there's also understanding that there can be difficulties with getting through English structurally, and that English does not relate our teachings and the relationality that is in our languages, and so comics visually can provide that. And so I think that there are a lot of possibilities there in ways that do not just become about representation, but rather are even more, deep into the kind of work that Arigon is doing, where it's self-belief and addressing suicide, just not by being like, oh, this is a comic about addressing suicide. It's providing role models and inspiration for youth to have pathways to understand being, having higher self-esteem about, So yeah, there's definitely a lot of possibilities there, both because of the function of games and comics, but also because of how that can reach youth and what can be portrayed through them.
I think the most amazing thing that I found with Super Indian in particular is that when I set out to write this, I was entertaining myself. And I wanted to tell a story that made me laugh and that would make my family laugh. And it was, I want to say a couple of things too. And you can layer so many things with drawings, with images, with the way you tell the story, and also with a lot of humor, lots of laughter, because my house was never silent. My dad was one of the funniest people you would have ever met. My sister kept me in stitches. And so I'm upholding my family to tell these stories, because I wanted to make sure within this, there was somebody that looked like my aunt or my cousin, or, that they didn't all look the same because, Super Indian's buff and all, but
He has nice hair, Megan was
got
pointing
nice
out.
hair.
She was like, look at his hair. And like on the poster size, you even notice it more. You're like, that hair though.
It's like, dude, that hair. So,
Not to call Megan out.
So here's my family. Okay, so there's my story, and I put it out there, and suddenly I start getting calls from colleges and universities saying,
Right.
well, Miss Starr, we'd like to teach your book in our class. And I'm like, what? When I got more and more calls from like the University of Washington and this one over here, SUNY Oneonta, when you were there in New York. And then people started to write, I'm going to write a scholarly treatise on. I was like, what? What? About blood quantum? The vampire that wanted to become a vampire by biting other full-blood Indians?
There's so much in there.
Yes, it's layered. But
layers.
that my silliness would translate into a college course is like, I'm not sure about that. And to me, that's where I feel like a fraud. Because I didn't start, that was not my purpose of writing these books. It was like, I need something to entertain myself because I don't want to see any more of those yucky books out there by Marvel and DC and Image. I don't want any more Scalped. I don't want any of that. I want to. If I could wipe those books off the face of the earth, I would do it.
And colorful, right? No sepia tone.
With
beautiful hair.
Every
with
time I do
beautiful
anything
hair.
in like monochrome, I think of you and like,
Yes,
like she would be yelling at me right now.
yes, with beautiful flowing hair and all that jazz. So, but that is how what we're doing up here is affecting education. Suddenly it gets picked up by scholars, or it gets picked up by, I'm going to bring it to my tribal library.
Yeah.
Yay!
I think a lot of my stuff only ends up in college classes because it would be banned in schools. The games make it into schools, but there are moments where I have to say, actually, the comics are, there's stuff in the comics that is not school appropriate.
Yeah.
So, and that's a good space for me. It's been a space where I can express that. Would you say? I mean, some of your
I feel like I'm sort of on the
too.
cusp. Like they haven't used too much of my stuff in education,
But they will.
They will.
Oh,
this
gosh.
this particular year, I've had
Yeah.
at least 3 or 4 educators come up to me, and they're using like the Deer Woman anthology, and they're using Six Killer, and I'm like, how are you utilizing this? This is really cool, but like, none of the classes I took in college would do anything with comics at all. Like you say comics, and they just point and like laugh at you, like
totally,
commercial art.
Right? It was worse than
Yeah.
commercial art, I think.
It is, it's comics.
Yeah, man.
Cheetos, man, Cheetos.
Yeah, Cheetos and video games, and you're living at your
Yes, I
parents' house.
see a hand.
hand.
Go ahead.
I'll just share some people at Texas State History Museum in Austin, Texas. I've met other museum people, Team American Indian from New York is here. And that's another educational space that, we're here because the art and storytelling and the gamification, where those things meet together in the game realm, we're convinced that that is really the future of how we're going to tell a lot of our stories. So, I just want you to know we're listening. And that's
thank you.
Thank you.
Yay.
We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then your work has been in museums, my work has been in museums, your work has been in museums. I think that is a really amazing space to consider for how to distribute. And then the layers that they can add in through museums are really amazing. So
yeah, because there's a respectability. If somebody sees something in a museum, it kind of validates it. Whereas if they saw it on a store shelf, they may have just bypassed it completely. So it's kind of forcing people to give it validity and then read more about it and then learn something from it. So
yeah, totally. Yeah, museums are awesome spaces.
Anybody else out there? Megan.
I'm just curious if the current environment has created more hostile situations online or elsewhere for you.
Not for me. I am clean.
Yeah.
Nobody has found me in that way. I
Well,
stay
you're
low.
clean.
I am clean, and I stay low. When they go low, I go high.
Just like just floats off.
I do. I swear.
I know.
Me and Oprah.
I know.
There we go.
Word. I know. And then I mean, I don't.
They come after you. They're like, oh,
Yeah, like I had to change my phone number this year because I was getting phone calls from numbers that were leaving like breathing messages at 4 in the morning. And I get hacks. I now know they're from Ohio.
nice.
So, but I regularly get like simultaneous hacks on my Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and I now have systems in place to know where they're coming from at the very least. I do have support from my university's police. They can track IP addresses of emails I receive. But I had a situation where it's like I collided with Gamergate initially, and they're like people, right? And so there was people in social media, and then that died down. And then with this latest rise in what happened, it was the government. And what I realized about this is that there is only one of me. I'm a single mom. I've been raising my 2 children on my own for 6.5 years now. And I do not have the wherewithal that the government has because the government continuously has been passing the torch to a new senator every time. And so I will think that it is dead, and then all of a sudden I'll start getting media calls again and all this and whatnot, and because they are creating new bills which are inspired by the game that I made, and they name me and they name the game, and it kicks it all back up again, and it raises a new fire. When I am trying to stay low, I'm not doing anything, but they're continuously trying. And so the latest incident, and then they try locally as well. And so I had, they have local organizations and branches, and they can go at me through all these different people. And so for the one person that I am, they can continue to pass it along to whoever they want to. And so it goes from like a coalition to a senator to local people. No, this is in the US. And so, so I'll get things like, a local organization published, well, they weren't local, they were somewhere else, but they published an opinion piece about me in the Lansing State Journal, which is a local publication, saying that my game, Thunderbird Strike, attacks low-income families because you play as a Thunderbird striking lightning down at mining companies and big giant mining trucks. And so then they were equating that with me saying, you know, attacking the jobs of anyone who works with oil industry. Just crazy off the wall things. But the latest was that they are working on a bill which is going through in the state of Minnesota. I'm in Michigan now, so this bill is in the state of Minnesota, that anyone who uses any kind of arts funding, because I had like $3,700 from the government to work on Thunderbird Strike through an arts grant, which was completely valid. Everything I said I did was completely upfront. But the government tried to go after me with one bill that was turned down because it went against freedom of speech. And then the latest bill is if anyone uses any kind of arts funding that comes from taxpayer funds for any kind of project which they determine conveys civil disobedience or domestic terrorism, which is what they said that my game promotes. They said that I'm training eco-terrorists and training domestic terrorists with my game. That was on Fox News. Then
consider the source.
Yeah, that was great. That was great. I got a lot of calls about that one. Then that person can be fined up to 10 times the amount that they were given. So this bill does not retroactively apply to me, but because I got like $3,700 some dollars, that means that the government, the Senate meets, they look at your project and they get to determine if your art does either of these things, and they could find someone like me $37,000, all right? So what this means is that it is being put in place to silence Indigenous voices in the arts, because who is going to be accused of anything like that? No one but someone who is Indigenous or anyone else who is a part of standing up against systematic racism and violence in this country. And so this is very real. And that bill's going through. There's actual video footage of all the senators sitting around in a room, and they're like, naturally, we do not want to use government funding to support domestic terrorism or civil disobedience. Stamp, next. It's that simple. And certainly it sounds reasonable on that level in that space, right? So
That's a state art.
that's a state art, that's a state law, right? And so that's the thing, is it's going through specifically in the state that I received that grant from, right? And but it has implications for what is happening on a governmental level as far as funding for any kind of work goes. Yeah. So it can be incredibly viscerally real. Yeah.
Yeah, and I personally am
Thank
meant
you.
to deal with much of that. I kind of learned from my dad, who was very politically active when I was a child, and we had FBI agents knocking on our door when I was
Right.
5. So I'm very cautious with what I do put out there, and I do try to not engage in. I kind of draw the line for myself. If I feel like I'm getting drained in some direction, or if I'm going to potentially encounter something like that, I kind of pull back a little bit. But it is kind of walking a very fine line, because you never know who's looking at your posts, who's following you. And with people that are supporting you, you're also going to get an equal amount of people that are against what you're saying and may potentially start harassing you and stuff like what you've experienced. So
Yeah.
I'm very cautious because I'm a mom.
Well,
I've
and
got
you
2
get
young
it from
kids, so, like,
companies, because if you stand up against companies, because I've seen you stand up against companies, and you'll get it back from them.
Yeah,
so
I
there
mean-
is something that you experience there, right?
Yeah, a little bit, but I mean,
Yeah.
I try to just block it.
Right.
A company coming back and saying anything, and I haven't actually received any harassment from any of these companies.
Right.
But yeah, I do go after, like most recently, there's a lot of issues with companies capitalizing off of sage use and ceremonials. Basically taking it, sticking it in New Age kits and charging lots of money for it and telling you that your life is going to be better and your house is going to be clean and free of bad demonic things. Just a lot of BS. So yeah, I have been making a point. I made an art piece on it, and I feel like that speaks louder than me going
Yeah.
after any individual company. But I also have been seen an increase in people tagging me like, oh, look at this company, hey, look at that company, look at this, look at that. And then all of a sudden it's just sort of like a tidal wave of, look at all this crap that you should single-handedly deal with. And so I have to step back, because I have jobs and responsibilities and my own personal health. I have to watch my kids, raise them, be a mom, be a wife, and find maybe an hour out of every week for myself. But
Good luck.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I think as Native people, often we try to stay in the safe realm. We don't like to disrupt the structure or shape the tree, or we kind of just operate under the radar. But I think we need to disrupt the way people think. And I think we need to have, we need to disrupt the way people view us and understand who we are. So I applaud you for disrupting the way people are thinking in a challenging way, because we can't continue to just be under the radar. We have to be above it, we have to be present. So thank you so much for.
Thank you.
We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and then go
And
ahead.
then let's go jig to the film. Only say it because I'm Métis. Everyone looks at me like, what are you talking about?
yes.
Okay, so there's 1 back here and 1 over here. Duke it out. Talk loud. 1, 2, 3, go.
What advice would you give your 10-year-old self?
Whoa.
Right? Where was I when I was 10, man?
That was just 2-3 years ago.
I know. No, I was really weird. So when I was around 10, 11, I started working, America Online just hit. Woo! 4-letter username. Woo! And I somehow convinced them that I was an adult, because I was using my parents' account with their information. And I started running a text role-playing community, which was about using sentences and punctuation, and it was called Storyline Role-Playing. And that's how I started. And so I would just be like, you're cool. That's all. I would just be like, you're cool, and it's okay, and everything's okay. And I know people are calling you Shamu the Whelp, but you're cool, and everything's fine. So that's what I would tell my 10-year-old self. Yeah, that's all I would
I would say to my 10-year-old self, it gets better.
Yeah.
Just hang in there, it gets better.
Yeah.
I think I probably would have recommended myself to go to a comic book store sooner. Like, I didn't know about comics until my mom came home from a yard sale with a long box of Flair cards from Marvel, and I was like, oh my god, like, they have stories on every character on the back, they have painted images in hollow foil. But I didn't realize that these were all parts of comic books. I had no clue what they were for. So for the longest time, I was like, I'm going to be a Flair card artist. That's my thing. That's what I wanted to do.
Else.
And then this
so
boy in my
cool.
class, he was like, no, there's a comic book shop. This is all related. So yeah.
That's cool. That's cute.
Okay, last question.
Okay, mine isn't really a question. I just wanted to, a couple comments on what you had to go through with their, well, been there, done that. In the 70s, American Indian movement, they tried to, put us in jail for burning American flags and stuff. But it's actually unconstitutional. So Minnesota might pass those laws. All you have to do is find, Marlon Brando, the pocket.
Good to know.
And it will come down as, this is unconstitutional.
Yeah.
So in your heart of hearts, you can be afraid of it, but it's like, don't be real afraid.
Yeah.
Because it's not going to go anywhere.
Cool.
The other thing is the way that, say, that the women's circle went in Seattle is to pick and choose your funding. So it's like that particular legal thing is going to be looking at, funders are going to give you. And so what we did is to say, fuck you.
Yeah.
We will find our own funding.
Yeah.
And we will simply not do with you. So I want to make sure everybody here doesn't leave thinking, oh my God, I don't do that anymore. One, it's unconstitutional. It cannot go anywhere. And two, the challenge that I see that hopefully you guys are coming up with is to figure out funding ways that just don't play their fucking game.
Yeah.
It's like, you want to pull my string, well, fuck off.
Yeah, that's what Lee Francis and Native Realities Press gave us that opportunity, I feel like. Like, I have never felt, and the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, like I've always been in a position where I'm consulting and I have to negotiate representations, and really what is happening is companies are bringing you on so that they can use your name and still kind of do what they're planning on doing anyway. And because of Native Realities Press, because of the Indigenous Comic-Con and getting us all together, we are able to say, you know what, actually crowdfunding, you know what, actually funding from tribes, but I also don't think that we should be going to tribes saying, you know what you should spend your money on? Games and comics. I don't think we should be doing that. I think tribes should be putting money into other things, and that we should help come up with that kind of funding too. So I think that there are a lot of other possibilities, and I'm really grateful for all of the support that Lee has offered us along the way, because that's a huge part of why we are where we are now.
Yeah, exactly.
Except for Arigon, she's always been amazing.
Anybody else? Closing things? What are you doing next? What are you doing next?
I'm going to get my voice back, and then I'm going to finish the video game with a
Yay!
Okay, and what are you doing next?
Yeah, I'm working on this video. Yeah, exactly. I know. I'm like, how many projects I get to talk about? This one, and then I'm working on Along the River Space Time, which is a virtual reality game, which will push me to 3D, which is like, woo!
Yay! And Super Indian Volume 3. So, okay, we're good.
Yeah,
We're good. Thank you.
Appreciate you all.